Chapter 1: The Whispering Fields. My name is Harold Whitlock, and I'm a third-generation farmer. The land I grew up on, the land I've tended all my life, was passed down to me from my father, and to him from my grandfather. It's more than just fields, it's our heritage, our pride, and our way of life. But if I had known what this land concealed, I would never have returned. My farm is located on the outskirts of a small town in Kansas. The wheat fields stretch as far as the eye can see, their golden waves looking so peaceful, as if time has stood still here. Locals called this place the Land of Shadows, and I always thought it was just a pretty name. But now, left alone after my wife's death, I realized it might be truer than it seemed. The first sign of something strange appeared 3 weeks ago. A whisper in the field. It was an ordinary evening. I was tinkering with the combine, checking the equipment before the harvest. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the land, and I caught a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the wheat rows, but the sound was too human. "Harold." Something whispered, barely audible. I froze in place. "Who's there?" I shouted, looking around but seeing no one. The field remained motionless, and only the rustling of wheat leaves created the illusion of movement. I thought it was fatigue and returned to work. But the voice repeated itself, this time a little louder. "Harold." This time I rushed towards the sound. I ran through the rows of wheat, but saw nothing. Only the feeling that someone was watching me did not leave me. When I returned home, something in the air was different. The old house creaked and groaned as always, but this time the sound seemed alien, as if I were hearing this place for the first time. A nocturnal visitor. That night I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of the field and that whisper were swirling in my head, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a creak. At first, I thought it was the old floorboards, but the sound repeated itself. It was the creak of the door on the porch. I got up, grabbed a flashlight and the rifle I always kept by the bed, and went to the front door. When I cautiously looked outside, I saw no one. But on the ground near the door lay a small pile of dry leaves that couldn't have been there. I had swept the porch during the day. "Who's there?" I called out into the darkness. In response, only the rustling of wheat. I returned to the house, locked the door, and decided not to think about it anymore. But then I didn't know it was just the beginning. Suspicions. The next day, I decided to walk around the farm and check if everything was all right. The field looked as usual, but I noticed strange circles in the wheat. They were perfectly even, as if someone had deliberately trampled them overnight. "Damn it," I muttered, thinking it was just a prank by teenagers. But as I walked through the field, I noticed something that made me stop. An old pocket knife with a wooden handle lay on the ground. I recognized it immediately. It was my father's knife. He always carried it with him, but after his death, the knife disappeared. How did it end up here? Memories flashed through my head. My father often said that the field knows more than it seems. I always took it as a metaphor, but now I began to doubt it. Another evening. That evening, the whisper returned. It sounded louder than before, and now I could make out individual words. "You shouldn't have stayed here." I dropped everything and ran to the house. I closed the door, turned off all the lights and sat in a chair with a rifle in my hands. But even behind closed doors, I could hear that voice. It was everywhere. Later that night, I heard something scratching at the door. It wasn't trying to get in, it was just irritating me with its presence. I sat there, clutching the rifle, and prayed for it to stop. When morning came, everything was quiet. But I already knew, this place wouldn't let me go that easily. Chapter 2: Roots of Darkness. The morning was unusually calm. The sun slowly rose over the fields, its rays piercing through the morning fog, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I decided to check the fields again, hoping to find at least some logical explanation for what had happened at night. The field looked familiar. Even rows of wheat swayed from a light breeze, but my eyes again fell on the same circles. They were trampled perfectly evenly, as if someone had specially created them for some purpose. I started to walk around one of the circles when I suddenly noticed something on the ground. It was an old wide-brimmed hat, dusty and darkened by time. I knew this hat because my grandfather used to wear it. "This can't be true," I whispered, picking up the hat. My grandfather died many years ago, and his things were stored in the old barn. I decided to check. The barn was a few hundred yards from the house, abandoned and neglected. Its door creaked when I opened it, and the smell of old wood and dust filled my nostrils. A discovery in the barn. In the corner of the barn stood a large wooden chest that I hadn't opened since I was a child. It contained my grandfather's things, clothes, old photographs, even his favorite pipe. But the hat wasn't there. I carefully examined the contents of the chest and found something I didn't expect, an old journal with a worn cover. The words, "Confessions of the Earth," were cut out on it. I opened the first page and saw my grandfather's handwriting. It was even and clear, every word written with care. "This land does not belong to us. We think we are its owners, but it is not so. We are just guests. There are rules that must be followed, and consequences if they are not." My heart pounded faster. I continued reading. Father told me to stay away from the south field. He said the roots of darkness were there. I didn't listen. Now I know he was right. They come at night, and their presence cannot be ignored. They feed on fear. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. What was it? Old superstitions? A figment of the imagination? Or did my grandfather really see what he wrote about, the south field? Despite the warning in the journal, I decided to check the south field. It was a bit off the main field, and I rarely went there. The path to it was overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to hide it from human eyes. When I reached the field, something had changed. There was no life energy here, as in other parts of the land. The grass was dry, and the wheat had a sickly appearance, yellow-green stems that seemed to rot right at the roots. In the center of the field, I saw a hole that looked like someone had dug it quite recently. I approached closer and saw that it was filled with bones. What the hell? I breathed, stepping back. The bones were of different sizes, large, animal-like, and smaller, human. At that moment, I heard the same whisper as before, but now it was closer, more intense. Harold, the voice drew out my name, stretching it so that the sound made my blood curdle. I rushed back to the house, barely breathing. A tale of the past. Returning home, I couldn't calm down. My grandfather was always a serious and restrained man, and I didn't believe he could make up such things. But his journal was proof that he had experienced something extraordinary. That night, I decided to look through old family photos. They were stored in a heavy album in my room. I flipped through the pages, filled with images of happy moments, family holidays, harvests, even children's birthdays. But on the last pages, I found something strange. In one of the photographs, taken many years ago, was my family standing against the background of the south field. Everyone looked normal, except for one moment. Behind them, among the wheat, a blurry silhouette was visible. It was a man. But his outlines were blurred, and his face could not be made out. "It can't be," I said aloud, pressing the photo closer to my eyes. Suddenly something rattled in the house. The sound came from the kitchen, and I heard something heavy fall to the floor. A guest in the house. I grabbed the flashlight and rifle, which I now always kept nearby, and cautiously went to the kitchen. The light was off, and the only source of light was the moon shining through the windows. On the floor was a pot that someone had obviously knocked off the table. But there was no one to be seen. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to hide my fear. In response, I heard only silence. I was about to return to the bedroom when I suddenly heard something rustling in the corner of the room. The flashlight caught a silhouette, and I almost dropped the rifle from my hands. It was the same hat that I found in the field. Only now it was not empty. Chapter 3, Shadows of the Past. The hat lay on the floor, but it was no longer just an old object. It was twitching, as if something was moving inside. I froze, my heart pounding, my fingers spasmodically squeezing the trigger. "This can't be real," I whispered, trying not to panic. The hat suddenly stopped, and a dark, sticky liquid began to flow from under it. Its smell was unbearably sweet and reminiscent of rotting flesh. I took a step back, not taking my eyes off what was happening. But suddenly the flashlight went out, leaving me in complete darkness. It seemed that the house was enveloped in a dead silence, broken only by the sound of breathing, heavy and wheezing, but it did not come from me. "Harold," the voice drew out my name again, this time very close. I grabbed the rifle with both hands and fired blindly into the darkness. The loud sound of the shot tore through the silence, and the light of the flashlight suddenly returned. The hat was gone. Only a dark stain remained on the floor. Returned to the journal. Not knowing what to do next, I returned to the bedroom where I left my grandfather's journal. The feeling of being watched did not leave me, even when I closed the door. I sat down at the table, turned on the desk lamp and continued reading. What comes is not alive, but it is not dead. It is a root that penetrates the earth and feeds on the fear of those who live here. They strive for restoration. The only way to stop them is to follow the rules. Then there were 3 rules listed. Do not enter the south field after sunset. Do not leave doors or windows open at night. Do not answer the voices that call your name. My hands trembled. I had already broken the first rule, and that explained why the events of recent days had become increasingly strange. I turned the page and saw another note. They will always find a way to get to you. But if you open the door for them, they will stay forever. My heart sank. I suddenly remembered how the door on the porch had been left unlocked the previous night. A nighttime attack. That night I heard them again. The whispers penetrated the walls, enveloping me from all sides. The words sounded clearer. We are waiting, Harold. My hands gripped the rifle, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Then there was a knock on the windows. It was slow, rhythmic, as if something large and heavy was trying to get inside. Who's there? I shouted, trying to overcome my fear. In response, I heard children's laughter, but it sounded unnatural, as if several voices were superimposed on each other. I rushed to the window, but instead of seeing someone, I only noticed silhouettes moving among the wheat. There were several of them, tall, long shadows that looked human, but not quite. I lowered the curtains and stepped back into the middle of the room. You can't get in here, I shouted, trying more to convince myself than them. But then I heard a sound. It was the creak of the door on the porch. A guest in the house. I rushed to the front door. It was closed, but the lock seemed to have been shaken, as if someone had just touched it. A terrible silence reigned in the house, and every step I took echoed loudly. When I returned to the living room, there was no one there. But I felt a cold that went to my bones. On the floor lay another thing that I could not explain. It was an old family photo torn from an album. It was me, my grandfather and my father, but my father's face was crossed out with black ink. On the back of the photo was written, "You're next." My hands trembled. I felt reality around me beginning to dissolve, and I realized that this place would not let me go without a fight. Chapter 4, The Edge of Reality. The next morning, a dense fog covered the field like a living blanket, hiding the outlines of the wheat. The air was still, and even the birds were not singing. I woke up earlier than usual with a heavy feeling in my chest. The photo found at night lay on the table, and every time I looked at it, I was overcome with panic. What is this doing to me? I muttered, squeezing the photo in my hands. I decided that I had to learn more about this land. My thoughts constantly returned to my grandfather's journal, especially to his mentions that they feed on fear. Visiting the archives. In the center of town was an old archive building. I decided to turn to local records, hoping to find something that could explain the origin of the South Field. The elderly woman at the counter greeted me cautiously, as if sensing my anxiety. "I'm looking for information about the land of my farm," I said. "Which land?" "The South Field," I replied, trying not to sound scared. Her face suddenly changed, her smile disappeared, and a shadow of fear appeared in her eyes. "Are you serious?" she asked. "That land is cursed." "Do you know that?" "What do you mean?" She disappeared behind the shelves and returned with a worn album that looked like it was 100 years old. The South Field was part of the land owned by the Ames family in the 1800s. They disappeared overnight. Nobody knows what happened, but locals found the bodies of their animals, mutilated in ways no one could explain. I flipped through the pages of the album. There were old photographs, maps, and records. One image made me stop. It was a photo of the field, but on it, among the wheat, was the same blurry silhouette that I had seen in my family photo. "What is that figure?" I asked. "Some say it's the spirit of the earth. Others believe it's someone the earth has swallowed. But one thing is clear, if you see it, it's no coincidence." My heart sank. Return to the South Field. I returned home, replaying the woman's words over and over in my head. The thought that I had seen it did not leave me. But I knew I couldn't leave everything as it was. This time I decided to go to the south field not out of curiosity, but to understand what this land wanted. In my hands, I held my grandfather's journal, and its entries were my only guide. When I reached the south field, the fog still enveloped it like a veil, hiding secrets. In the center was the same pit with bones, but now they looked different. The bones were arranged in some strange shape, similar to a star. I stood at the edge of the pit, holding the journal in my hands. The voices returned. They were louder than ever. "They will not forgive," the whisper hissed. "What do you want?" I shouted, waving the journal. In response, the wheat began to move, although there was no wind. Its stems twisted like hands trying to grab me. I stepped back, but then remembered the words in the journal, "Don't run." I froze in place, feeling the air thicken. The voices began to speak in a different tone, low and piercing. "Return what belongs to us." The old chest. I returned to the barn, realizing that the key to everything was hidden in the past. My grandfather's chest again caught my attention. At the bottom, under layers of old clothes, I found a wooden box that I had never seen before. When I opened it, I found two objects inside, a piece of parchment with writing in an unknown language and a small metal key. On the parchment were symbols similar to those I had seen on the bones in the south field. Next to it was a note from my grandfather: "If you find this, it means they have returned. The only way to stop them is to seal the field again. But remember, the sacrifice is inevitable." My heart sank. A sacrifice? What did he mean? Approaching night. When I returned home, the sun was already setting. The shadows were getting longer, and the voices began to sound again around the house. I knew I would have to go to the south field that night. I gathered a flashlight, a journal, and a key. Before leaving, I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes looked tired, but there was determination in them. "This time I'll stop it," I said to myself. When I left the house, the wheat in the field was already swaying, although there was no wind. The voices became clearer, and the darkness seemed almost alive. Chapter 5: A Sealed Pact. Night descended upon the field so quickly that it seemed as if the clouds had blotted out the last rays of the sun, creating impenetrable darkness. The lantern shone weakly, and each step seemed louder than the last. The voices grew closer and louder, the words blending into an incomprehensible chorus, but among them I clearly heard my name, Harold. Harold! I clutched my grandfather's old journal, the key, and the lantern, feeling fear gradually turn into cold determination. I knew this night would be decisive, and there was no turning back. I in the heart of the south field. When I reached the south field, everything looked even more ominous than during the day. The pit, filled with bones, now glowed with a soft red light emanating from the symbols that had appeared on the ground around it. These symbols pulsed as if alive, radiating heat that could be felt even from a distance. I approached closer, and the voices in my head became clearer. "You took what belongs to us. You must return it. What do you want?" I shouted, looking around. "I don't know what you're talking about." Suddenly, a shadow rose from the pit, long and ghostly, resembling a human figure, but its movements were unnatural. It seemed to glide, not touching the ground, and its eyes glowed with a yellow fire. "They always knew you would return," the shadow's voice boomed, both hoarse and melodious. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow pointed at the box I was holding. "Open it," the voice commanded. My heart pounded like a drum, but I had no choice. I inserted the key into the lock and slowly turned it. The lock clicked, and the lid of the box lifted on its own. Inside was a small parchment with strange symbols, similar to those that pulsed on the ground around the pit. "Put it in the pit," the voice commanded. "Why should I trust you?" I shouted. "This is not about trust," the shadow replied, approaching me. "It's about duty. The sacrifice." My hands trembled as I approached the pit. The symbols on the parchment began to glow, and the ground beneath my feet shook. I remembered my grandfather's words in the journal: "The sacrifice is inevitable." "What kind of sacrifice?" I whispered. "Your blood," the shadow replied. At that moment, I realized that the sacrifice had always been a part of this ritual. The shadow came closer, its eyes so bright it seemed they were looking straight into my soul. "If you do not perform the ritual, everything you love will be destroyed. The land will take its own. I picked up the parchment and threw it into the pit. At that moment, the symbols around me flashed with a bright light, and the voices changed their tone. They no longer whispered, but cried out, as if being torn apart. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate, and I saw roots stretching out of the pit, wrapping around my legs. They were hot, like red-hot metal. "Take me, but leave my home alone," I shouted, falling to my knees. The roots stopped abruptly, and the voices fell silent. The shadow froze in place, its eyes extinguished. For a few seconds, the field was plunged into absolute silence. A sealed pact. When everything was quiet, I felt myself being released. The roots returned to the earth, and the shadow dissolved into the air. The symbols around the pit gradually faded, leaving only scorched marks on the ground. I fell to my knees, breathing heavily. My hands were covered in cuts, but the pain no longer mattered. I knew the ritual was complete. "Is it over?" I whispered to myself. In response, the field remained silent, returning home. When I returned home, it was well past midnight. The house was quiet, and for the first time in recent days, there was no feeling of an alien presence. I sat on the old sofa, feeling incredibly tired but also a strange sense of relief. My gaze fell on the box that I was still holding. The lock had closed again, as if its contents were never meant to be opened again. I put it on the table and was about to go to bed when I saw something in the window. There, among the wheat, stood a figure. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze. Chapter 6, Aftermath of the Ritual. I stood frozen, staring out the window. The figure stood motionless in the wheat, as if waiting for me. Its outline was barely visible in the soft moonlight, but I could clearly feel its presence. It wasn't an illusion or a figment of my imagination, it was real. "What do you want?" I whispered, though I knew I wouldn't get an answer. It didn't move, it just watched. But there was something sinister in its silence, like a warning, morning after darkness. The next morning, when the sun rose over the horizon, the field looked as it always had. Golden stalks of wheat swayed in the breeze, and nothing seemed to recall the events of the previous night. I gathered my thoughts, got dressed, and decided to check the south field. My heart pounded as I approached the pit, but when I reached the spot where it had been, there was nothing left. No pit, no symbols, not even any visible bones. "This is impossible," I breathed. The ground was level, as if everything I had seen had never existed. But when I bent closer, I noticed a small piece of burnt parchment, half buried in the soil. The same symbols I had seen at night were faintly visible on it. I picked it up and tucked it into my pocket, returned to the archives. I went back to the archives, hoping to find answers. The elderly woman behind the counter greeted me with suspicion, but when I showed her the parchment, her face turned pale. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Do you know what this is?" "No," I admitted. "But you seem to." She led me to a back room where old maps and records were kept. "This symbol belongs to an ancient cult that once existed on this land. They believed that every piece of land had its own soul, and to keep the harvest, sacrifices had to be made." "What kind of sacrifices?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Human," she replied. Her words cut through me like a knife. "But the cult disappeared over 100 years ago. The land was supposed to be cleansed." "Apparently, not completely," I muttered, facing the truth. That night, I sat on the porch, holding my rifle. I knew it wasn't over yet. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me all day. Suddenly, I heard the wheat rustling. I stood up, pointed the lantern at the field, and saw the same figure. This time it was closer. Its outline was clearer, but its face remained indistinct, as if shrouded in fog. "You got what you wanted," I shouted. "What more do you want?" The figure took a step forward, and I heard the same voice that had haunted me all this time. "This is just the beginning." I pulled the trigger. The shot tore through the night, but when the smoke cleared, the figure had vanished. The field remained motionless, the final entry. I decided to go back to my grandfather's journal. There was a final page that I hadn't noticed before. Its words were like a warning: the land always takes what is its own. Even if you think it's over, it will always find a way to reclaim what belongs to it. I closed the journal, realizing that this place would forever remain cursed. I couldn't just leave, the field was now a part of me. When I looked out the window one last time that night, I saw her again. The figure stood among the wheat, closer than ever before. And I knew then, she would never leave.